Vivian, stop talking. You have no idea what you're saying, Miles hissed, his voice tight with panic. Vivian's words slurred slightly as she glared at him, her perfectly manicured hand gripping the edge of the table for stability. I know exactly what I'm saying, she spat back. The healthy glow she'd been flaunting all morning had drained from her face, leaving her skin waxy and pale. We've been planning this for months, ever since Eliza started landing every major account. You were supposed to make sure she drank that special smoothie today. My stomach twisted into knots as I continued recording on my phone, carefully keeping it partially hidden behind my purse. The company wellness event, ironically themed Healthy Body, Healthy Career, had transformed into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The paramedics burst through the conference room doors, equipment bags slung over their shoulders. I quickly stepped aside, my heart hammering against my ribcage. As they assessed Vivian and transferred her onto a stretcher, I stopped recording and immediately sent the video to both my private email and my lawyer with trembling fingers. A precaution I'd started taking months ago when my suspicions first arose. Miles stood frozen by the refreshment table, the color draining from his face as he watched his carefully constructed plan spectacularly backfire. The green smoothie, the one he'd been so insistent I try this morning, was still sitting untouched where I'd left it after swapping cups with Vivian. My nursing background had taught me to trust my instincts, and the oddly medicinal smell beneath the kale and mint had triggered all my alarm bells. I'll ride with her to the hospital, I announced to the paramedics, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my body. I grabbed my bag and straightened my shoulders. After all, I should make sure my sister-in-law gets the proper treatment. I met Miles's terrified gaze across the room, my words carrying a double meaning that made him flinch visibly. I'm sure the doctors will be very interested in learning exactly what was in that special smoothie recipe. The emergency room at Boston General was chaotic with its usual Friday morning rush as medical staff hurried to treat Vivian. I sat rigidly in the waiting room, clutching my phone and replaying the video I'd captured, the unmistakable tremor in Vivian's voice, the panic flashing in her eyes as the toxins she'd intended for me began affecting her instead. My heart ached with betrayal even as relief washed over me. After months of mysterious illnesses following meals with my husband and his sister, I finally had concrete proof that I wasn't suffering from paranoia or stress as they'd repeatedly suggested. I scrolled through my health app, reviewing the patterns I'd been documenting: elevated heart rate, drops in blood pressure, all following social events with Miles and Vivian. As a former nurse, I'd recognized the symptoms but couldn't prove their cause until now. Family of Vivian Frost, a nurse called out, clipboard in hand. I stood up, scanning the waiting area and noting Miles's conspicuous absence. He'd mumbled something about moving his car nearly 30 minutes ago and had conveniently disappeared. I'm her sister-in-law, I said, following the nurse through the double doors. The antiseptic smell triggered memories of my own career in healthcare before I'd switched to sales. How is she doing? The nurse's expression turned grave as she led me down the corridor. She's stable for now, but we found concerning levels of several substances in her initial blood work. She lowered her voice professionally. Dr. Lawrence would like to speak with you about some unusual findings. Dr. Lawrence, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and perceptive eyes, was reviewing a chart outside Vivian's room. She looked up as we approached. Mrs. Donovan, she greeted me, extending her hand. Could you walk me through exactly what happened before your sister-in-law became ill? I took a steadying breath, pulling out my phone. I think you should listen to this first. I played the recording from the wellness event, watching as the doctor's expression transformed from professional concern to alarmed recognition. This is extremely serious, she said, making notes on her tablet with quick, precise movements. The substances we're detecting aren't things that accidentally find their way into a smoothie. We're looking at deliberate contamination with what appears to be pharmaceutically derived compounds. Just then, Miles appeared at the end of the hallway, his face ashen and glistening with nervous sweat. He'd clearly overheard the doctor's assessment. "Eliza," he called, taking a hesitant step toward me, "let me explain what's happening." "Stay back," Dr. Lawrence warned firmly, pressing the nurse call button at the wall station. "Security to room 305, please." Immediately. Miles raised his hands in surrender, his designer watch glinting under the fluorescent lights. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding." Vivian was confused from whatever she drank. She had no idea what she was saying. "Really?" I pulled out my smartphone and opened the screenshots I'd saved. "So these messages between you and Vivian about making sure I'm out of commission before the Westridge presentation were just innocent conversation?" I scrolled through several exchanges, my finger trembling slightly despite my outward composure. "You two discussing dosages and timing, that was just friendly banter?" The color drained completely from his face. "You went through my phone?" His voice cracked with indignation rather than remorse. "After I found the unmarked bottles in your gym bag 3 weeks ago, you bet I did." I turned to Dr. Lawrence, my former nursing training giving me the vocabulary I needed. "Doctor, I've been hospitalized 3 times in the past 6 months with unexplained symptoms, nausea, dizziness, heart palpitations, and disorientation. I'd like to know if the toxins match what you found in Vivian's system today." Dr. Lawrence's eyes narrowed with professional intensity. "We'll need to run comparative analyses." In the meantime, she glanced toward the 2 security officers who had appeared behind Miles. "Security will ensure your husband remains available for questioning." The guards positioned themselves on either side of Miles, who suddenly looked much smaller than his 6-foot frame. His carefully cultivated image of the charming husband was disintegrating before my eyes. "Vivian and I," he stammered, desperation replacing his usual confidence, "we were just trying to help you slow down. You've been working too hard, taking all the major accounts, pushing yourself to the point of exhaustion." From inside her hospital room, Vivian called out weakly, "If we could just make you take some time off." "By poisoning me?" My voice remained level, though my knuckles had turned white around my phone. A strange clarity had settled over me, like the calm in the center of a hurricane. "How long have you been doing this? Was it you who tampered with my food at the company retreat too? Is that why I spent 2 days violently ill while you covered my meetings?" Miles's silence confirmed everything. Through the observation window, I could see Vivian lying in her hospital bed, connected to various monitors. Her usual imperious demeanor had vanished, replaced by the unmistakable fear of someone who realized their actions had real consequences. "Detective Rivera is on her way," Dr. Lawrence said quietly. "She'll want statements from everyone involved." I nodded, feeling an odd sense of calm wash over me. After months of gaslighting, being told my symptoms were just stress or that I was working too hard, the truth was finally emerging. There was no going back now. Detective Rivera arrived within 40 minutes, her confident stride and alert eyes commanding attention in the sterile hospital corridor. She introduced herself as a specialist in cases involving domestic abuse and corporate crime. I played the wellness event recording for her and showed her the text messages I'd documented meticulously over the past months. "Mrs. Donovan," she said, reviewing her notes with practiced efficiency, "you mentioned previous illnesses. Can you elaborate on those incidents?" I pulled out my phone again, opening a detailed health journal I'd been maintaining since my suspicions first arose. The first episode was in February, after a dinner at Vivian's downtown condo. I experienced severe gastric distress and vertigo that lasted nearly 2 days. The second was in April, what I now call the tea incident, when Miles insisted I try a special blend Vivian had created. And then in May, after our breakfast meeting. My voice remained steady as I continued cataloging the events. The symptoms had varied slightly each time, just enough that doctors had written them off as unrelated stress responses or minor infections. Detective Rivera's expression grew increasingly focused as she examined my detailed log of dates, symptoms, and circumstances. And you've been maintaining these records on your own initiative? I started noticing patterns. I hesitated before removing a second phone from my bag, a basic model I'd purchased with cash. I also began carrying this backup phone with an unregistered number. I used it to record conversations whenever I was around them. I have several where Vivian and Miles discuss their project, though they're careful to maintain plausible deniability. I played one of the recordings, where Vivian's voice came through with crystal clarity. The Westridge account is worth over $8 million in annual revenue, Miles. We can't let her take lead on this one too. Just follow the plan. A few days of illness should be enough for them to reassign the presentation. Miles's response followed, equally damning. I've got something more effective this time. She definitely won't make it to the client meeting. Detective Rivera's expression hardened as she listened. Through the room's window, I could see Vivian was now awake, looking decidedly less confident than she had at the wellness event that morning. The hospital lab is running comprehensive toxicology panels, the detective informed me. Dr. Lawrence has already identified several concerning substances that don't occur naturally in smoothies or food. We'll need samples from your home kitchen and office space as well. A commotion erupted down the corridor. Miles was arguing with the security guards, his voice rising with desperate intensity. I need to speak with my wife, he shouted, attempting to push past them. Eliza, please. You don't understand what's been happening. We were trying to help you. Detective Rivera stepped between us with practiced authority. Mr. Donovan, you're not improving your situation. We already have evidence suggesting premeditated. Miles let out a strained laugh that echoed eerily through the hallway. That's absurd. We were just trying to slow her down. She was working herself into the ground, taking all the major accounts, pushing herself too hard. From her hospital bed, Vivian called out, if we could just make her take some time off by poisoning her? Detective Rivera's voice cut like steel. That's not protection, Mr. Donovan. That's attempted murder. The blood drained from Miles's face so rapidly I thought he might faint. Murder? No, that's impossible. We never meant to. It wasn't supposed to. Then what exactly did you intend? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. When you put those substances in my smoothie this morning, what precisely was supposed to happen to me? Miles's silence spoke volumes. Behind him, I could see Vivian watching through her hospital room window, her expression calculating even through her obvious discomfort. I recognized that look. She was frantically trying to construct a narrative, to reframe months of systematic poisoning as some misguided attempt to help me. We'll need both their phones and electronic devices, Detective Rivera instructed the security personnel. And I want officers posted at both doors. No one leaves until we receive the complete toxicology results. Dr. Lawrence entered Vivian's room with a tablet in hand, her expression grave as she reviewed the latest test results. Detective Rivera and I followed closely, while Miles remained in the hallway under guard. Vivian tried to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, but the tremors in her hands hadn't fully subsided. The medical monitors beeped steadily in the background, creating an ominous rhythm to our confrontation. The toxicology report shows elevated levels of multiple concerning substances, Dr. Lawrence announced, her voice clinical yet tinged with unmistakable alarm. Most troubling is the presence of a particular compound typically used in pharmaceutical research. This isn't something available to the general public. Vivian's already pale face blanched further. That's completely impossible. Her voice cracked with panic. From the doorway, Miles called out, it was just supposed to cause mild symptoms. Nothing dangerous. Mild symptoms? Detective Rivera countered sharply, pulling out her notebook. Like the ones Mrs. Donovan experienced repeatedly over the past 6 months? The door opened, and a second detective entered carrying a sealed evidence bag. We found these in Mr. Donovan's desk drawer at their corporate headquarters, he reported, presenting several small unlabeled bottles alongside a notebook containing detailed handwritten notes about dosages, timing, and observed reactions. My legs nearly gave out as the full scope of their scheme became horrifyingly clear. I gripped the edge of Vivian's bed to steady myself. You were documenting everything? Like I was some kind of laboratory experiment? It wasn't like that. Vivian protested, though her voice wavered unconvincingly. We just needed to track what was effective. The initial attempts weren't strong enough, you kept showing up to client meetings anyway, even when you were clearly unwell. So you deliberately increased the dosages, Detective Rivera concluded, examining the evidence with gloved hands. Were you aware these substances could be lethal at higher concentrations? A heavy silence fell over the room. Through the window, I could see Miles collapse into a chair in the hallway, head buried in his hands, the perfect image of a man watching his life implode. The Westridge account, I said slowly, the pieces finally clicking together in my mind. This wasn't just about one presentation, was it? You needed me permanently removed because the client specifically requested me as their account lead after the initial meeting. Vivian's face contorted with a toxic mixture of fear and unrestrained anger. You were destroying everything I'd built. I cultivated that client portfolio for 5 years, and then you waltz in with your background in healthcare and your perfect presentations, and suddenly everyone only wants to work with you. And Miles said he could fix the problem, I finished for her. The unspoken implication, by killing me, hung in the air between us, heavy with its monstrous weight. We weren't trying to, Vivian began defensively, but Dr. Lawrence interrupted her. The concentration in the smoothie you consumed today, the doctor stated firmly, looking directly at Vivian, was significantly higher than the traces we've identified in Ms. Donovan's previous medical samples. If she had consumed it as intended, the outcome would have been severe, possibly fatal. The clinical assessment landed like a physical blow. Even Vivian seemed momentarily stunned by the reality of what they'd nearly accomplished. Detective Rivera turned to her colleague. We'll need comprehensive search warrants for both their residences and workplaces. And contact the pharmaceutical manufacturer listed on these labels, find out how they obtained these regulated substances. Vivian slumped back against her pillows, the fight visibly draining from her. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she whispered, more to herself than anyone in the room. Miles kept saying we just needed one more attempt with a stronger dose. I stepped closer to her bed, my voice remarkably steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. Every time I got sick, every meeting I missed, every client I temporarily lost, you two were right there, watching and taking notes on how your poison was affecting me. What kind of people does that make you? The silence that followed felt suffocating. Outside in the corridor, I could hear officers reading Miles his rights as additional police arrived. Vivian stared blankly at her hands, unable or unwilling to meet my gaze. Detective, I said, turning away from my sister-in-law, I'm ready to provide my formal statement now. The trial spanned 4 grueling weeks, though it felt like an eternity. I sat in the courtroom each day, watching as the prosecution methodically presented their case against Miles and Vivian. The evidence was overwhelming: the bottles from Miles's office, their detailed journal documenting each poisoning attempt, the recorded conversations and incriminating text messages discussing their project. What struck me most powerfully was their demeanor throughout the proceedings. Vivian, normally so impeccably polished and commanding, appeared diminished in her defendant's chair. Miles couldn't even look in my direction, keeping his gaze fixed on the table or floor as expert witnesses detailed the potentially fatal effects of the substances they'd been administering to me. Dr. Lawrence's testimony proved particularly damning. She presented a comprehensive analysis showing how they had systematically increased the dosages over time, demonstrating clear intent to cause increasingly serious harm. A pharmaceutical company representative confirmed that Vivian had diverted the compounds through her position in their research division, falsifying records to cover her tracks. The defendants exhibited a calculated, escalating pattern of behavior, the prosecutor emphasized in her powerful closing statement. This wasn't merely corporate sabotage or an attempt to sideline a competitor. This was a systematic, premeditated attempt to seriously harm Mrs. Donovan, with a clear escalation that could have ultimately resulted in death. When the verdict was finally read, I felt no sense of triumph, only profound relief tinged with lingering sadness. Both Miles and Vivian were found guilty on multiple counts, including attempted murder and criminal conspiracy. The judge's words resonated through the hushed courtroom. The premeditated nature of these actions, carried out against a family member over an extended period, with clear escalation of intent to harm, demands the maximum sentence under the law. I watched silently as they were led away in handcuffs, contemplating how professional jealousy and personal resentment had transformed two seemingly successful people into something unrecognizable. Their careers, their reputations, their freedom, all sacrificed in a calculated attempt to destroy me simply because I'd excelled at my job. As the courtroom began to empty, my company's CEO approached and quietly assured me my position would be waiting whenever I was ready to return. Several colleagues who had testified about the toxic competitive culture Vivian had fostered stopped to express their support. Their kindness only amplified the stark contrast between professional ambition and criminal obsession. 18 months after the trial, I stood at the podium of the Boston Business Innovation Summit, preparing to deliver the keynote address to a packed auditorium. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was precisely the kind of professional visibility Vivian had schemed so desperately to prevent me from achieving. The Westridge account, which she and Miles had been willing to poison me for, had blossomed into several major client relationships, establishing me as one of the top sales executives in the New England region. The stage lights felt warm on my face as I surveyed the audience of industry leaders and ambitious professionals. My journey to this moment had been far from the traditional path to success, but perhaps that made it all the more meaningful. True success isn't merely about talent or determination, I began, my voice steady and clear through the microphone. It's fundamentally about integrity and building genuine relationships based on mutual trust and respect. I paused deliberately, letting the words settle across the room. Sometimes, the greatest threats to our professional journey come from those we least expect, even those closest to us. But surviving those challenges doesn't just make us resilient, it transforms us into more authentic leaders. As I continued my presentation, I shared insights on ethical leadership and creating healthy workplace cultures without directly referencing my personal ordeal. The audience responded with enthusiastic engagement, many furiously taking notes or nodding in recognition of truths that resonated with their own experiences. After the speech concluded and the applause faded, I found myself surrounded by attendees eager to connect. A young woman with determined eyes and a firm handshake approached me last, waiting patiently until the crowd had thinned. "That was incredibly powerful," she said, introducing herself as a recent MBA graduate beginning her career in medical sales. "Everyone knows parts of your story from the news coverage, but what they don't talk about is how you maintained such poise throughout everything. How did you stay focused when your world was collapsing around you?" I considered her question carefully, recognizing the genuine curiosity behind it. "I concentrated on what I could actually control," I told her, recalling the clarity that had emerged from the chaos. "I gathered evidence methodically, trusted my instincts when everyone was telling me I was overreacting, and refused to let fear dictate my choices or derail my professional goals. Most importantly, I discovered which colleagues were truly allies, people who valued merit over office politics." Her grateful smile reminded me of myself before everything had happened, and I felt a surge of responsibility to help create safer professional environments for the next generation. Later that evening, back in my hotel room, I received an email from the Westridge CEO confirming they were extending their contract for another 3 years with an expanded scope. I smiled, remembering how differently things might have unfolded if I hadn't trusted my former nurse's intuition that day at the wellness event when I noticed the strange medicinal undertone in that supposedly healthy smoothie. The morning newspaper had included a small article about Miles and Vivian beginning their prison sentences after their appeals were denied. I'd glanced at the headline but hadn't read further. Instead, I opened my laptop and focused on finalizing the proposal for my newest client project, a healthcare communications initiative that leveraged both my sales expertise and my background in nursing. The Boston skyline glittered outside my window as night fell, a fitting backdrop to my reflections. I realized that the greatest form of resilience wasn't about getting revenge or even justice. It was about moving forward purposefully and succeeding despite those who tried to undermine you. The professional landscape I now navigated was changed forever by what had happened, but so was I, stronger, more discerning, and determined to create positive impact through my work. The following morning, as I checked out of the hotel, my phone buzzed with a message from my company's ethics committee. They wanted me to help develop new workplace safety protocols and anti-harassment training. I smiled as I texted back my acceptance, finding perfect symmetry in transforming my personal trauma into institutional protection for others.